Have you ever witnessed a courtroom where in just a few seconds the entire atmosphere suddenly felt like it stopped breathing? With just one sentence, a child shook the entire room, full of power and silence. "You're my mom." The one who spoke wasn't a lawyer, nor was it a witness. It was a 12-year-old boy on trial for trespassing, and the one who heard those words was the very judge preparing to deliver the verdict. An abandoned boy, a woman who had buried her past, and a truth that no one in that courtroom could have foreseen. In this video, I will take you through a true, strange, and deeply moving story, a trial that seemed simple but revealed the deep wounds of an entire system. A tearful reunion, not at an airport or hospital, but in a criminal courtroom. And above all, a journey to rediscover a maternal bond buried under time and fear for over a decade. We won't just hear a story. We'll look into slices of society where law, morality, and humanity collide in all their complexity. If you've ever asked yourself, can someone who's made a mistake be forgiven? Or can love be reborn from loss? Then this video is for you. Because this isn't just the journey of one child. It might be your journey too, of memories we thought we'd forgotten and the connections we long to find again just once. And now come with me back to where it all began, a cold courtroom, where a boy spoke a truth that made the world fall silent. That morning, the courtroom was unusually crowded. People came out of curiosity. A 12-year-old black boy had been arrested while walking through an upscale neighborhood residence called the police because they felt he didn't belong there. The boy sat quietly at the defendant's table, the oversized chair dwarfing his small frame, an old hoodie draped over his shoulders, his eyes cast downward. His name was Jaden. The judge that day was Rebecca Hart, a woman everyone feared for her sternness and cold demeanor. She walked in without expression, without a single soft glance at the boy across the room. The trial began like any other testimonies, arguments, notes. Everything followed the script until Jaden looked up straight into the judge's eyes and uttered the three words no one expected. "You're my mom." No one said anything. No one moved. No one breathed. The air in the courtroom seemed to freeze. Even the pen in Rebecca's hand stopped midair, as if time itself had stalled. What seemed like a simple case, a boy wandering into a rich neighborhood, had turned into an emotional earthquake. No one knew what to do when the truth shattered the boundaries of law, when authority and past collided without warning. Rebecca walked out of the courtroom without saying a word. Jaden, his voice trembling, added, "My foster mom told me. You gave me away. I just wanted to know why." And just like that, a seemingly simple question carried more weight than any sentence ever could. Why did that moment leave everyone unable to look away? Because it was one of those rare moments when a person must face the two things we all fear: the truth and the moment when we can no longer run from it. It's like trying to live your life well, live normally, and then suddenly your buried past walks into the room, looks you in the eye, and asks why we can dodge responsibility. Try to forget. But sometimes truth finds its way at the most unexpected time. In the history of the United States, there have been many court cases derailed because of unexpected relationships between the defendant and the one delivering justice. In some cases, the judge turned out to be the godfather of the accused. In others, the prosecutor was someone who had once dated the victim's mother. But a child calling the judge mom in front of dozens of eyes is something even the most seasoned reporters were stunned into silence by. Sometimes the very thing we try hardest to bury is the thing someone else has spent a lifetime searching for. And when that truth finally surfaces, it doesn't destroy us, it frees us. Truth can make us tremble. But within that trembling, we sometimes find love, courage, and a second chance. And as Jaden's words still echoed in the room, people no longer saw this as just a trespassing case. They started asking a bigger question: was this boy really being prosecuted just for existing in the wrong place? To understand why that truth struck such a chord with the entire community, we need to look more closely at what was happening beneath the surface. A justice system that has never been fair to children like Jaden. Jaden is not the first child brought to court for not belonging. In fact, if you look at data from the past 20 years, one thing becomes clear. Being black, Jaden's skin color is not just a color. It's an identifier, a label that causes the system to look at him with suspicion. Imagine that morning again. A white boy wearing the same old hoodie walking through a wealthy neighborhood. People might think maybe he's lost. He needs help. But with Jaden, they said he's up to no good. Call the police. And that's how many stories we've heard. Begin. Statistics from the ACLU show black children in the U.S. are 2 to 3 times more likely to be arrested for juvenile behavior than white children, even though there's no significant difference in crime rates. In an ideal system, justice should be colorblind. But here justice isn't blind. It seems cross-eyed. It clearly sees your skin color. And sometimes that's all it needs to convict you in society's eyes. Think of the case of Khalif Browder, a 16-year-old black boy in New York, jailed for 3 years at Rikers Island for allegedly stealing a backpack. He was never tried. There was no solid evidence. When he was finally released, Khalif was no longer the same. A few years later, he took his own life. All because of a suspicion, because of his skin color, because the system learned to fear, not to understand. When Jaden sat in that courtroom that day, many saw a troublemaker. But if you looked more closely, you'd see he was just a 12-year-old child, thin-tired, and far too used to skeptical eyes. When a system is built on fear and prejudice, then none of us are truly protected. Because today it's Jaden. Tomorrow it could be your child, your grandchild, or even you, just for walking through the wrong neighborhood. If justice doesn't protect the most vulnerable child, then it isn't justice. It's a sentence hanging by a thread. But the injustice Jaden faced didn't stop at his skin color. It ran deeper, spread wider, and reached into every corner of his life, even the place that was supposed to be called home. And to understand how a boy could look up at the woman sentencing him and say, "Mom," we have to go further into another system just as cruel, the American foster care system. If you saw Jaden in court that day, messy curls, a worn-out hoodie, and eyes no longer innocent, what would you think? A bad kid? A troubled boy? Or just a child with no one to go home to? Jaden never knew what home truly meant. Since he was only a few months old, he'd been placed in foster care, a system many still refer to with a hopeful name, foster care. But for Jaden, it wasn't nurturing. It was a transfer station for repeated abandonment. By the time he turned 12, he had lived in over 7 different homes, each one offering a little affection, a bit of strangeness, and then another departure because they couldn't keep him, because he didn't fit in, because he was difficult. And you know what, Jaden wasn't the exception. According to data from the Child Welfare Information Gateway, more than 400,000 children are currently in foster care in the U.S. Among them, tens of thousands are moved 3 or more times a year. Every move is a new goodbye, a new scar. Imagine this. How can a child believe in the world when the world keeps telling him, "You don't get to stay"? In 2019, a 4-year-old boy named Noah Quattro was beaten to death by his foster parents, even though there had been previous warnings from Child Protective Services. The very systems meant to protect these children are sometimes the starting point of their pain. For Jaden, being on trial didn't start when the police cuffed him. It started long before that. It started with cold dinners and no one asking how his day was, with midnight moves because the new family ran out of space, with no one showing up at parent-teacher meetings, with him having to tell himself every day it's okay. I'm used to it. Sometimes society sees only the behavior and never the wounds. We blame kids for being bad without asking who first made them stop trusting adults. If you see a child who's angry, rebellious, or even violent, look deeper. That may not be a bad kid, but a heart that's been broken one too many times. And in Jaden's case, the most heartbreaking thing is this. The person he waited 12 years for, the one he hoped would come back, was the same person sitting in the judge's robe, holding a gavel about to sentence him. To understand why Rebecca, that woman, chose to stay silent for so long, we need to rewind time, back to where it all began, a small town, a young girl, and a decision that shaped a lifetime. To the public, Rebecca Hart is the embodiment of law, sharp, disciplined, never allowing emotion to interfere with judgment. She once said in a televised interview, "I believe in absolute justice. No leniency, no favoritism." And people believed her. No one saw that behind that calm exterior was a heart that had frozen a long time ago, not from lack of feeling, but from too many emotions with nowhere to go. Rebecca at 18 was a very different person, a young girl living in a small southern town where every whisper traveled farther than the church bells. When she found out she was pregnant, Rebecca wasn't terrified of the baby. She was terrified of her parents' eyes, the neighbors, the church, the school. Her family told her, "You'll ruin your future if you keep this baby." People didn't call Rebecca a mother-to-be. They called her a troubled girl. In that coldly lit hospital room, Rebecca held her son just once, then signed a paper termination of parental rights. No one prepared her for that feeling. No one taught her how to let go. And from that moment on, Rebecca chose to live differently. No weakness, no deviation, no cracks in the wall. Because if that past ever surfaced, everything she built would collapse. Sometimes the coldest people are those who once loved the deepest and were hurt just as deeply. In 2016, a female judge in Michigan was harshly criticized for sentencing a teenage boy to jail for stealing bread. Later, it was discovered that she herself had grown up in extreme poverty, and her severity stemmed from the fear of ever returning to that past. Just like Rebecca, they weren't heartless. They were just running from their own tenderness. The more we try to appear strong, the more we forget that wounds don't disappear just because we cover them with success. You can sit on the highest bench in a courtroom, hold a gavel in your hand, but if there's still a child crying inside you, you haven't truly healed. And at the moment Jaden looked her in the eye and called her mom, Rebecca wasn't facing a defendant. She was facing a part of herself she had buried for 12 years. But what happens when that crack begins to spread, when a heart thought frozen begins to thaw, when a woman who seemed immovable begins to tremble? To answer that we need to return to the moment past and present collided in that very courtroom. Rebecca once believed that time could erase the past, but there are memories that don't fade. They just lie dormant in a deep corner of the heart, waiting for the day they return unexpectedly. And that day came when a boy stood in the middle of a courtroom and said, "You're my mom." Not everyone understands the pain of a young mother who wasn't ready. Even fewer know how cruel society can be to 17 or 18-year-old girls who get pregnant unexpectedly. Rebecca was a high school senior at the time, a smart girl with a scholarship in hand, her whole future mapped out by her parents. But one tiny red line on a pregnancy test and everything shattered. Her family didn't ask, "What do you want to do?" They just said, "You'll ruin your life if you keep that baby. Do the right thing. Forget this ever happened." And what did the right thing mean to them? Giving birth in silence, signing away her parental rights, walking out of the hospital as if she'd never carried a living being inside her. Rebecca was not the only one who's gone through this. According to statistics from the Guttmacher Institute, around 750,000 American teens become pregnant every year, and most of them face pressure, stigma, and isolation. Many are forced to give up their child because of poverty, lack of support, or simply fear. One well-known example is singer Patti Smith, who shared in her memoir that she had to give up her first child because she couldn't provide for him, though it was one of the most painful decisions of her life. The stories of young mothers are not just about being unfit or unloving. Sometimes they are sacrifices framed by others. People say, "Let the child have a better life." But who can guarantee that, who can promise that the child won't grow up lonely with a heart that always feels incomplete? Not every decision is wrong, but every decision must belong to the one who lives with its consequences. If you force someone to give up, you may not be saving them. You may be condemning them to a life they're too afraid to remember. That's how Rebecca lived a life without memory. But memories don't vanish. They live quietly in the eyes of a boy and explode on the day he calls her mom. Now with the past fully exposed, Rebecca could no longer turn away. Jaden's question still lingered. "Why did you give me away?" And to answer that she had to do the hardest thing, to stop being a judge and be a mother facing her own son. There was something Rebecca had never told anyone, perhaps not even herself. Her silence had protected no one. Silence was what Rebecca believed was the safest way to survive. Don't mention the child. Don't ask what happened to him. Don't reopen that door. She thought, if you don't touch the wound, it will heal. But now in front of her stood Jaden. The wound made flesh, bearing thousands of questions that no one had answered in 12 years. And Jaden didn't just want an answer. He needed someone brave enough to stop running. You see, when a child is abandoned, they don't just lose a family. They lose their sense of self. The question, "Who am I?" becomes a void that no one fills. Each new foster home is a mismatched puzzle piece, making Jaden grow up feeling like no place was truly his. Worse still, when even the woman who gave him life chose silence. That pain became almost unspeakable. A study from the National Foster Youth Institute found children in long-term foster care face far higher risks of depression, attachment disorders, and self-harming behaviors compared to children in stable families. With every year that passed without someone stepping forward, without anyone taking responsibility, that crack grew wider until it shattered not just hearts but trust in the world itself. In 2013, Davian, only a 15-year-old boy in Florida's foster system, stood at a church pulpit and said, "I just want someone to adopt me. I promise I'll be a good kid. I just want a family." His speech brought millions to tears, but it took over a year before he found a temporary family, and even then he was sent back because he didn't fit. The system's silence isn't just neglect, it's abandonment institutionalized. And Rebecca, though unintentionally, was part of that silence. Not speaking didn't mean she wasn't hurting. Choosing silence might have made life easier for the adult, but it left the child trapped in an unanswered question. Sometimes even a clumsy explanation means more than a perfect silence. Jaden didn't need a perfect mother. He needed someone who dared to admit she was his mother no matter how messy the past. And if Rebecca truly wanted to heal, she would have to put down the gavel and open her heart for the first time in years. But is it even possible to face the child you once abandoned? Can a mother's love be revived after more than a decade of separation? The answer comes only in that moment when two people finally sit down, not as judge and defendant, but as mother and son. The door closes. A small, pale conference room inside the courthouse. Only two chairs, one table, and two people sitting face to face. On one side, Rebecca, the most powerful figure in that courtroom. On the other, Jaden, a 12-year-old boy carrying more questions than any child his age should. But in that moment, no one could keep their composure. No gavel, no lawyers. Only the truth and the pain. "Why did you give me away?" The question came out as if Jaden had been holding it in his heart his whole life. Not to accuse, just to understand. Rebecca bowed her head, hands clenched tightly as if to steady her voice. I I was scared. I was too young. I didn't know what to do. And everyone said you'd be better off without me." Jaden didn't blink, his voice hoarse. "Better off? Do you know where I've been these past 12 years?" He spoke of cold nights in foster care, of families who came and went, of broken promises, "We'll be your family," and then silence. "I used to think you were dead. I hoped that you were, because that would hurt less than knowing you were alive and just never came." That confrontation wasn't pure anger. It was a cry to be acknowledged, to be seen, to have someone say, "I'm sorry, I missed you." If you've ever been abandoned by someone you loved, even just by their silence, you'll understand that pain. It's not just betrayal. It's feeling erased from their world as if you never existed. And when that person returns, you don't just need an explanation. You need a reason to believe you were worthy of love all along. A recent example that moved America was the story of Casey Adams, a 19-year-old who grew up in foster care, reuniting with his biological mother during a group therapy session. He didn't cry, he didn't yell, he just asked, "Why didn't you ever write to me?" His mother stayed silent for 3 minutes, then hugged him and sobbed uncontrollably. Not out of guilt, but because at last she had the chance to be heard and forgiven. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't begin with, "I'm sorry." It begins with the courage to sit down and listen, even when what you hear breaks your heart. Rebecca made no promises, no justifications. She only said, "I was wrong. I don't know if you'll forgive me, but if you'll let me, I want to be here. Now. For you." And for the first time, Jaden looked at her not as a judge, not as the woman who gave him away, but as someone trying finally to begin again. That moment didn't heal everything, but it opened a door. Because no matter how many tears have fallen, wherever there's someone truly willing to begin again, there is still hope. But the journey from child of someone who left to a real family doesn't happen with just one conversation. It's a long process of learning how to trust, how to love, and how to stay. And that's exactly what happened after that day. A journey full of uncertainty, but also full of quiet miracles. There was no emotional hug right after that talk, no tearful mom, no dramatic forgiveness like in the movies. Just a small nod, an expression slightly softer than the day before, and a tiny sliver of hope, just enough for both of them to meet again the following week. Healing doesn't happen in one meeting. It comes from small steps, slow, and sometimes even backwards. Rebecca knew that after so many years apart, She couldn't expect Jaden to trust her immediately, because trust isn't a gift. It's the result of consistency and sincerity repeated over time. The first week they sat in a park, talked about the weather. The second week they discussed favorite foods. The third week, Jaden told her about his first friend in foster care, a boy nicknamed Buzz, because he always pretended to be an astronaut. Each time Rebecca just listened. No interruptions, no explanations. Just listened as a mother should have from the beginning. And slowly Jaden began to open up. He started texting her first, invited her to his weekend basketball game. And one day after winning his first match, he ran to where Rebecca was standing a little awkward and said, "Did I play well, Mom?" There was no applause, but in Rebecca's heart it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. Healing is rarely loud. It arrives like a gentle breeze after a storm, enough to soothe but fragile, if not nurtured. This reminds me of the story of Josh Shipp, a well-known American author who grew up in foster care. Josh was placed with over 12 different families before he met Rodney, a tough but consistent foster father. Josh recounted, "I did everything I could to make him give up on me, but he just said, 'Not so easy, kid. I'm not going anywhere.'" It was that unconditional staying that changed Josh's life. From a rebellious teenager, he became a speaker who's helped millions of young people rediscover their self-worth. Love isn't just what you say, it's the decision to stay even when you're not yet welcomed. And sometimes what a child needs most isn't the words "I love you," but the steady proof that I won't leave you again. Rebecca wasn't perfect. Jaden was still hurt, but together they began rebuilding from something very small. The belief that love could still start over. And one day they walked into court again, not as defendant and judge, but as mother and son seeking to officially become a family. But even though paperwork can legalize a relationship, what made that moment sacred wasn't the documents. It was the journey they took to get there. Rebecca had once sat on the judge's bench and issued hundreds of sentences. She had stood before countless people demanding honesty, fairness, responsibility. But never had she asked herself, can someone who once gave up their child still deserve to be a mother? Can a judge step down from her bench to reclaim an old role with a new heart? That question wasn't just emotional, it was a real legal matter. Can a judge reclaim parental rights to her biological child after having previously relinquished them? The answer is yes, but it's not easy. According to laws in many U.S. states, if someone has legally terminated their parental rights, they must file a petition to restore or reassume guardianship. And this can only happen when the child consents if they're old enough. There's no conflict of interest. And most importantly, the decision serves the best interest of the child. In Rebecca's case, things were even more complicated because she wasn't just the birth mother. She had presided over Jaden's case herself. Some of her colleagues advised her to keep her distance to avoid damaging her professional credibility. But Rebecca no longer cared about reputation. To her, being human mattered more than maintaining status. Judge, lawyer, public servant. These titles require ethics and justice, but motherhood needs something else. A heart that can admit its mistakes and dare to begin again. In 2009 in Illinois, a mother who had lost custody due to alcoholism completed rehab and successfully petitioned to regain guardianship. The remarkable part, the very girl who once reported her mother was the one who wrote to the court pleading for her return. Because as she said, not every adult who makes a mistake deserves to be left behind forever. Sometimes justice needs compassion, and sometimes fairness is not in the punishment, but in the chance to make things right. Rebecca understood the past couldn't be erased, but she also knew if she remained in her role as judge, she would always see her son as a case file, not a child in need of love. So she picked up a pen and signed a document. Not a warrant, not a verdict, but a petition to be a mother again. A humble act, a step back from power to move closer to her son's heart. A few weeks later, Jaden signed the approval too, not because he had forgotten what had happened, but because he wanted to write a new chapter, one where his mother was part of the story. And on a gentle sunny day, they walked into court again. But this time, Rebecca wasn't wearing a black robe. She didn't hold a gavel. She was just a mother holding her son's hand. And for the first time in many years, both felt we can start again, right from the place where everything once ended. That morning, the courtroom wasn't packed like the first time Jaden appeared. There were no media spotlights, no murmuring crowd of strangers, just a small group, a few court staff, a former guardian, and one woman who had laid down all power to stand beside the child she once left behind. Rebecca was no longer Judge Hart. She was just Rebecca, a mother asking to begin again. And Jaden was no longer a defendant. He was a boy standing at the threshold of something new. For the first time, someone stood up in a court of law and said, I will be responsible for this child's life. The presiding judge that day read through the file, then smiled gently. Today, we're not judging the past. Today, we are recognizing a new future. She tapped the wooden gavel softly on the bench, not with the usual authority, but with a tender affirmation of a fresh start. Shirin. After the hearing, Rebecca bent down and asked quietly, Are you okay? Jaden didn't answer right away, but then with a slightly awkward smile, he nodded. Yeah, I think we'll be okay. You see, true redemption isn't about being forgiven immediately. It's about choosing to stay to do better every day and not give up even when nothing feels perfect yet. Jaden and Rebecca's story didn't end with a tearful hug. There was no swelling music, no dramatic "the end" in bold letters. Because this isn't the ending. It's the beginning of a new chapter where two people who had lost each other are learning to live side by side again. In Minnesota, there was a mother who lost custody of her three children due to mental illness. She worked tirelessly to heal and later won back her parental rights. Today, she works as a legal advocate for other single mothers, helping them avoid the same path she once walked. At a conference, she once said, I'm not trying to be the perfect mom. I'm just trying to be the mom who shows up every day. Don't wait until you're perfect to go back to the ones you love, because sometimes what they need most is simply someone who chooses to stay awkwardly, imperfectly, but wholeheartedly. Rebecca and Jaden are still learning how to be mother and son. They move slowly. They stumble. There are awkward moments. There are arguments. But they walk together, and that's what matters most. Maybe you've made mistakes. Maybe you've missed someone in your life. But if you still carry love in your heart, and if you dare to step forward, then sometimes life gives you a second chance. Not to erase the past, but to prove that love, even when it comes late, is still worth beginning. And if you're watching this video carrying some crack in your heart from family childhood or someone who once left, remember this family isn't about blood. It's about those who choose not to leave even when they could. Thank you for walking this journey to the very end. If this story touched you, leave a comment, share your thoughts, or simply send it to someone who may need to hear it. Because sometimes one small story can help someone begin something truly big. Ishakum. And that's the end of this journey, not perfect but honest, not complete but full of hope.